Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching every insane conspiracy theory that turned out to be true by the Paint Explainer. I saw this one pop up in my recommended, thought it sounded interesting, decided to check it out. So if y'all end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Heart attack pistol. In 1975, William Colby, the CIA director at the time, had to testify in front of a committee that was investigating the CIA. This happened because there were many accusations of assassinations of foreign and American politicians from the CIA.
Yeah, many. The CIA's gotten up to a lot of shady business throughout history. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you this, right? They have been involved in the assassinations of a lot of foreign leaders, and they've definitely been suspected of being involved. The FBI as well, in the assassination of some figures domestically here in America.
So the U.S. Senate put it under investigation for alleged covert action abuses, which resulted in 14 reports of major abuses by the CIA, FBI, and NSA. However, there was an accusation or conspiracy theory that was much more worrying than the rest of them. It was thought that the CIA had developed a pistol that could fire a poison dart from around 300 feet, cause death, and leave no trace of what the cause was.
Damn.
When William Colby declared that they had a poison dart gun that was potentially basically completely silent, felt like a mosquito bite to the target, went through clothes, caused a heart attack, and left no traces but a small red spot because the dart melted, the public was shocked. Furthermore, it was revealed that this wasn't an isolated case. It was part of Project MK Naomi, a project designed to increase U.S. biological and chemical warfare capabilities. This was the only time this gun was shown in public. USA's
All I'm going to say on sort of CIA involvement, and I don't want to sound too conspiratorial, though I know this is a video about conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, but think of what we do know about the CIA. That's already pretty crazy. And then try to imagine what we don't know. Right? Now, look, whenever any sort of event happens around the world, a lot of people immediately point to CIA involvement. If there's no evidence, then, you shouldn't do that, right? We need to know what's actually happening. But the CIA is certainly involved in a lot of tricky business, today and historically around the world. So there's a lot of stuff they've done that I'm sure we don't know, even right now.
fake Cuban terrorist attack. In 1962, during the Cold War, tensions between the US and Cuba were high because Fidel Castro had risen to power in Cuba and allowed communists to join the new Cuban government, nationalized US businesses, and improved relations with the Soviet Union.
Though funnily enough, Fidel's initial revolution in Cuba, it had not been sort of explicitly communist. I mean, of course, there had been communist, Marxist, socialist members of his revolutionary movement, but he was more of a sort of leftist, liberal nationalist, right? That was sort of his style of Cuban revolution. But as the revolution went on, he gained power. The United States essentially rebuffed a lot of his outreach, and Fidel, well, in response to that, continued to get more and more left-wing, eventually turning to the Soviet Union as a foreign partner, right? So it's funny, you see a lot of examples of this to where leaders, revolutionary leaders, will sometimes actually turn to the West or the United States first. And the US will say, nope, not interested, we don't like you. And so then they'll turn to the Soviets, right? Which is sort of a fairly logical shift at that time. There's two great superpowers. One refuses, you go to the other. Right, so there are several examples of this to where a movement doesn't necessarily start off at least entirely communist, but it becomes that through the United States' refusal to, at least show some sort of recognition or step in a little bit.
Furthermore, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles capable of hitting the U.S. on Cuban soil after the U.S. placed theirs on Italy and Turkey. Operation Northwoods was a plan by the United States Department of Defense to stage terrorist attacks against American citizens and blame the Cuban government in order to justify a war against Cuba. They wanted to hijack civilian planes and make them appear as if U.S. Air Force planes were shot down by Cuba to simulate the downing of a U.S. fighter jet off the coast of Cuba to blow a U.S. ship and to organize terrorist attacks in U.S. cities. The plan also included creating a Cuban communist terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, which would involve bombing civilian targets. The plan was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but was ultimately rejected by President John F. Kennedy because it would have been too risky and could have
Yeah.
led to a full-scale war with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, you really needed to be careful during that era. You've got these two nuclear armed superpowers. The end of the world is sort of right over the horizon. And I will say, I mean, that one's especially out there. That's literally sort of planning a fake terrorist attack. However, there are examples of attacks that were not necessarily real or were misinterpreted to cause war, right? You can look at the USS Maine with the Spanish American War. That was one that was immediately claimed to be the fault of the Spanish, even though that's likely not the case, right? Oftentimes accidents happen, but, you can sometimes claim that accident was on purpose and use it to start a war.
CIA's fake animals. In the 1970s, the CIA developed what they called the Insectothopter, which was a drone the size of a dragonfly and hand-painted to look like one. It was kept secret until December 2003, when it was revealed to the public at the CIA museum, and the project was abandoned because it was too difficult to fly in crosswinds.
Damn.
Another similar project was the AeroVironment Nano Hummingbird, created with specifications given by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. These weren't the only times they used animals or crafted fake animals to spy on their enemies. During the Cold War, they developed a camera so light that it could be carried by pigeons in order to take aerial photos, and they even trained some of these pigeons to drop eavesdropping devices onto window ledges. However, despite successfully placing some of these devices, no usable audio was captured from them.
Yeah, I think this is part of where the whole birds aren't real internet movement, partially ironic, partially not, comes from.
Even used fake fish to secretly check water samples for the presence of nuclear runoff or other suspicious substances. USA's fake Vietnam attack. In 1964, tensions between the United States and North Vietnam were at an all-time high, and things worsened on the 2nd of August when North Vietnamese forces shot at a U.S. destroyer while it was doing a covert operation close to North Vietnamese territorial waters. The U.S. government then, on the 4th of August, said that a second attack happened, while this was false. The commander of the Maddox, Captain John Herrick, initially reported the attack but later expressed doubts, attributing the radar signals to freak weather effects. And despite these uncertainties, the Lyndon Johnson administration relied on misinterpreted communications intercepts to conclude that the attack was real. Also, in October 2005, the New York Times reported that Robert J. Hanyuk, an historian for the NSA, concluded that the NSA distorted intelligence reports passed to policymakers. He said agency staff deliberately skewed the evidence to make it appear that an attack had occurred.
Yeah, so we're essentially talking here about the United States' involvement in Vietnam. Now, of course, the US was already involved at that point, but the LBJ administration wanted to sort of publicly acknowledge their involvement and, ramp it up, right? And they felt they needed some excuse to do that, a casus belli, right? A reason to go to war. And so we have the Gulf of Tonkin attack, right? Which is essentially fabricated. You saw afterwards, captain of the ship was like, you know what? I don't actually think that attack happened. But it was used by the administration to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is a joint resolution passed by Congress, which essentially gave LBJ a blank check, let him do whatever he wanted in Vietnam without needing congressional approval to go to war, right? So it's just sort of a sidestepping of that authority, which Congress is supposed to be able to wield to sort of declare war, saying to him, you know what, you can do whatever you want. We give you permission. You don't need us to declare war. And that attack that was certainly misinterpreted, if not fully fabricated, was to provide that justification.
This was probably done with the goal of providing the Johnson administration with the justification needed for military action in Vietnam. Years after the incident, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the time, admitted himself that the August 4th attack had never occurred. The Johnson administration...
Of course, other attacks had happened, to be clear, but just this incident that we're talking about right now, yeah, that one was likely entirely fabricated, if not misinterpreted, to get this resolution, to get this excuse.
administration was probably just seeking a reason to escalate American involvement in Vietnam
Mm-hmm.
as Cold War tensions increased, and the domino theory made its way through the US military, which said that the fall of one country to communism would lead to the fall of others in the region, causing more fear. Because of this false operation, Congress passed the
Right.
Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson broad powers to conduct military operations in
Yep.
Vietnam without a formal declaration of war.
Exactly. And by the way, this strategy has essentially been used since. Congress has devolved a lot of its power to the office of the presidency, which now has much broader powers than it previously did. Of course, the president is commander in chief, already had a lot of power in relation to the military, but now presidents don't even need a formal declaration of war. That's sort of gone. That check and balance that was put in place.
Canada's gay radar. At that
Oh,
time, homosexual people were persecuted by the Canadian government, and they were trying to find new ways to get rid of them from public jobs, especially the police and military. In the 1960s, Dr. Frank Robert Wake, a psychology professor at Carleton University, developed what's called the gaydar or fruit machine, which was a series of psychological tests with the purpose of identifying gay men. It worked by using erotic images and what were thought to be homosexual words to see if there were any physiological changes that could point to a sexual arousal, such as the dilation of their pupils. Of course, this machine was completely pseudoscientific and unreliable. The
yeah,
room's
I was gonna say, it doesn't sound like it would be incredibly effective.
light could change the dilation of the pupil, and many more outside variables made it faulty. Nonetheless, these tests caused hundreds, if not thousands, of people to get fired. The US government poisoned
Damn.
alcohol. From
Oh
1920
yeah,
to 19
I've heard this one before.
1933, the United States banned alcohol, entering the Prohibition era. This made the alcohol black market flourish, enabling criminal organizations like the Mafia to enrich themselves. So the United States government had to find a way to stop this. They went to extreme lengths to try to reduce the black market's activity and to make people stop drinking, but their efforts had poor results. So the government became frustrated and started adding large amounts of methyl alcohol, a substance that made the illegal drinks really dangerous.
Right, so you have this situation where alcohol is prohibited in most cases, right? So what that means is, this is what happens with a lot of kinds of prohibition. It doesn't get rid of the demand. You've just gotten rid of the supply. And so what happens? Well, people turn to other sources to get their alcohol. In this case, illegal sources, mostly through the mafia and sort of gangs at that time. That already makes it incredibly more dangerous because the process of making and distributing alcohol is now unregulated, right? So people be putting a lot of weird stuff in there that's dangerous for human consumption. It also means to get sort of more alcohol in a smaller form, drinks became a lot more alcoholic, which is also more dangerous. It's more easy to get alcohol poisoning and die like that. But additionally, and of course, not to mention all of the sort of gang violence and mafia crime that came from it. But additionally, if that wasn't dangerous enough, the United States government also starts poisoning some of these alcoholic beverages, right? In order to sort of enforce prohibition. Now, all that really does is lead to the injury or death of people who drink them. So it's, frankly, a pretty horrible solution to the problem. And like I said, we see this with prohibition. We see this issue with a lot of kinds of prohibition for a lot of different substances.
As a very small amount of undiluted methyl alcohol could kill a human being. This was probably done thinking that the black market sellers would have avoided selling poisoned alcohol to their customers, as they would have lost them when they died. But they didn't take into account that the demand for illegal alcohol was so booming at the time that the sellers didn't really care about their customers' lives. The effects quickly showed. In 1926, in New York City, 585 people died from this government action, and over 5,000 fatalities from this poisoning. At least a 600% increase from the previous deaths from alcohol were said to have resulted in the entire country. CIA's fake vaccines.
Oh.
During the hunt for Osama bin Laden, the CIA conducted a secret operation using a fake hepatitis vaccination program in Pakistan to illegally collect blood samples and confirm the presence of bin Laden or his family. The CIA planned to compare the DNA samples collected from the program with the DNA of bin Laden's sister, who had died in Boston in 2010. The program ultimately failed. It led to the arrest of a participating doctor, Shakil Afridi, and was widely criticized for undermining public health. The operation
Yeah, the CIA tends to not really mind undermining public health if they can do what they want to do. You've got providing fake vaccines. You've got spreading anti-vax misinformation. They did that, I believe, recently in the Philippines to prevent usage of Chinese vaccines. Spread a lot of anti-vax propaganda on social media. So the CIA and public health don't tend to get along.
Operation is blamed for increasing vaccine hesitancy in
I'm
Pakistan and
sure.
triggering violence against healthcare workers, who were perceived as spies. As a result, Pakistan saw a resurgence of polio, becoming the country with the highest number of polio cases in the world by 2014. The
Mm.
CIA director issued a directive in 2013 prohibiting the agency from using vaccination programs for operational purposes, including recruiting healthcare workers. It's in situations like these that we see the impact information has on our perception and beliefs. The
Mm.
health of the Pakistani population was undermined by disinformation that caused disbelief in the healthcare system. It's
Yep.
crucial to get an objective view on matters. For example, news outlets might frame stories through a different lens based on their political leanings and interests. Fortunately, today's
Oh,
sponsor, Ground
okay.
News, addresses this issue by
I
enabling
was like, where are we going here? Into an ad. I'll let the ad run through.
information from a multitude of sources. For example, it has been reported that Mexico warned they would impose their own tariffs in retaliation if Trump were to
Uh-oh.
impose a 25% tariff on Mexican goods. 348 sources reported on this, primarily from the center, with less coverage from right and left-leaning outlets. This creates what Ground News calls a potential blind spot in critical analysis for people who typically consume right and left-leaning sources. The differences in coverage between political leanings are clear. For example, a right-leaning source calls Trump's tariff proposition a threat, while a left-leaning source describes the situation in a more intense way. Ground News doesn't tell you what to think. They gather the world's news to help you come to your own independent conclusions. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum, so I can see stories I normally wouldn't have. I really think Ground News' mission aligns with what I aim to do here on my channel, so go to ground.news/TPE to stay informed with context you can't find anywhere else. Or scan my QR code for 50% off the same top-tier Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring this video.
All right.
Operation Sea Spray. In 1950, the Navy wanted to test the vulnerability of a city like San Francisco to a biological weapons attack in a project called Operation Sea Spray.
Huh?
To do so, they released two types of bacteria, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, into San Francisco Bay. The operation happened between September 20th.
I guess this shouldn't be so surprising, but a lot of this is involving either United States intelligence agencies, United States government, or the CIA. Maybe we'll get some FBI in there as well.
And 27th, and the bacteria were
Not too
released from a ship
surprising, I
off
guess.
the coast of San Francisco. It's said that they did this because they thought they would have been harmless to humans, but on October 11th, 11 residents checked into Stanford Hospital in San Francisco with very rare, serious urinary tract infections. 10 of them recovered, but one man, who had had recent prostate surgery, died 3 weeks later from a heart valve infection. His relatives later tried to sue the government, but they lost because the bacteria used in the test was unproven to be responsible for his death. The urinary tract outbreak was so unusual that the Stanford doctors wrote it up for a medical journal. None of the other hospitals in the city reported similar spikes in cases, and all 11 victims had urinary tract infections following medical procedures, suggesting that the source of their infections was inside the hospital. Cases of pneumonia in San Francisco also increased after Serratia marcescens was released, even though a causal relationship has not been established. Overall, the Army determined that San Francisco had received enough of a dose for nearly all of the city's 800,000 residents to inhale at least 5,000 of the particles,
Great.
which is within the range of infectivity for
Great.
anthrax. Project Sunshine. Project Sunshine was a series of research studies done by the US government that began in 1953 to see the impact of radioactive fallout on the world's population, which remained secret until 3 years later, in 1956. They wanted to see the body's reaction to radioactive isotope strontium-90, which represented the most serious threat to human health from nuclear fallout, especially on kids, since they're young.
They're saying, all right, so how much nuclear war can we do before it really becomes dangerous to people? I mean, come on. Can nuclear fallout really be that bad for you?
Developing bone tissues have the highest propensity to accumulate strontium-90, and thus they have the highest susceptibility to radiation damage. Of course, this type of experiment wasn't that feasible, since doing it on alive humans
Right.
would be an ethical monstrosity, and there weren't many familiars that would like to donate their deceased loved ones to be experimented on.
Yeah, I can't think of too many medical review boards that would consent to that sort of experiment.
Like this. Somehow, though, 1,500 sample
Somehow.
cadavers, mostly babies and young children,
Oh.
appeared out of nowhere.
Come
That's
on.
because they were taken from countries ranging from Australia to Europe, often without their parents' consent or knowledge.
Jesus.
A British mother had even said that her stillborn baby's legs were removed by British doctors, and to prevent her from finding out what had happened, she was not allowed to dress the baby for the funeral. The Dalai Lama worked for the CIA.
Damn.
During the Cold War, it seemed like China and its Communist Party wanted to increase their influence on Tibet, which worried the United
Tibet?
States. Consequently, the CIA created what was called the CIA Tibetan Program, where they trained and strengthened various isolated Tibetan resistance
This is like a classic CIA anti-communist program. You could find these probably in just about any communist country you looked at during the Cold War. Right, you've got a communist government. All right, let's locate some type of resistance group. Doesn't really matter what kind of resistance group. We're fine at drawing from sort of any side of the political spectrum. Arm them, train them a little bit. Maybe it goes somewhere, maybe it doesn't. But you'll see a lot of this kind of CIA involvement with a lot of these groups during the Cold War.
Groups, which eventually led to the creation of a paramilitary force of 2,000 men. They also sent military supplies in stealthy ways to not attract China's attention, and they spread pro-Tibetan propaganda by showing the human rights abuses in Tibet under Chinese rule. The plan reached $1.7 million of annual funding, and the funny thing is that the Dalai Lama himself received an annual salary of $180,000.
He was raking it in.
From the late 1950s to the mid-1970s, even though he stated that he used most of the funds received from the CIA to finance the activities of the Tibetan government in exile. His brother, Gyalo Thondup, was also considered a CIA's top asset. The program ended after President Nixon visited China to establish closer relations in 1972. But
there you've got détente between the United States and China. Thanks to old Richard Nixon. Maybe not what you would have expected him to have done, but the United States sort of wanted to put a wedge between the communist countries, Soviet Union, China. The USSR and China had already had a bit of a falling out, so the US said, why don't we cozy up to China? We closen our relationship. That'll, of course, weaken the stance of the USSR. Also, can maybe help us out in Vietnam, Cambodia, all these different countries we've been bombing and losing wars to, especially Vietnam. Maybe we can sort of bring some of this to an end. So old Nixon brings the U.S. closer to China.
Dalai Lama and his brother thought that this demonstrated that the U.S. didn't care about genuinely helping the Tibetan people, but that they were following their own interests in the Cold War.
Of course.
The U.S. president's wife became the real president. Edith Wilson was the wife of President Woodrow Wilson when, in October 1919, he suffered a stroke that heavily incapacitated him.
Yeah, I will say, if you thought that Joe Biden wasn't running the show, you should take a look at Woodrow Wilson. This man has a stroke. He's almost entirely incapacitated, and his wife essentially runs the office while he can't really do much.
They hid the true extent of the president's illness and disability from the American public, and although she was never officially elected president of the United States, she played a significant role in managing the country after her husband's condition. And
she did, extremely significant. Like I said, Woodrow Wilson, very incapacitated, almost entirely incapacitated. I don't know exactly the extent of it, but his wife essentially took over a lot of those responsibilities that, he was previously doing as U.S. president. So, like I said, she was really running the show sort of behind the scenes while trying to hide her husband's condition from everybody else.
Some scholars even call her the secret president, or the first woman president. She took control of many of the day-to-day functions of the executive branch, deciding which communications, issues, and matters of state were important enough to bring to the bedridden president's attention. For this reason, she required that all members of the cabinet send urgent matters, memoranda, correspondence, questions, and requests to her. In this way, she became the sole link of communication between the president and his cabinet. Even though she claimed that she didn't take any decisions herself, her role as a potential gatekeeper of info.
That's exactly right. You're a gatekeeper, you're a middleman, essentially. So, clearly, Wilson was there enough to take some things while he was in bed, but she controlled that access. People in that position often like to deny that it provides them any real power, but that position of gatekeeper, that lets you make some serious decisions.
Gave her lots of power and influence, and some suggest that she even successfully pushed for the removal of Secretary of State Robert Lansing.
Damn.
CIA's cat spies. In the 1960s,
More animal spies.
Operation Acoustic Kitty was launched, which aimed to use cats as spies. This project's estimated cost, according to former CIA officer Victor Marchetti, was around $20 million, and the
Wow.
procedure consisted of implanting a
I feel like I've heard of this one before as well, using cats as spies.
microphone in the cat's ear canal, a small radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and a
Oh.
thin wire in its fur. The first mission of a cat spy was to eavesdrop on two men in a park near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The cat was released nearby, but was almost immediately hit by a taxi. However, Robert
God.
Wallace, a former director of
You know, I mean, I love cats. I just feel like they wouldn't necessarily make the greatest spies. I think cats are pretty famous for basically doing what they want. They can be pretty hard to control. So a cat as a spy, how do you make sure the cat does what you want? You know, it could just wander off in any direction. No, I don't know if cats are really suited for that type of responsibility.
of the CIA's Office of Technical Service, disputed this version in 2013. He said the project was abandoned due to the difficulty in training the cat. This failure,
Right.
accompanied by other failed tests, caused the project to get shut down in 1967. USA's gay bomb.
Oh?
The idea of a gay bomb, a non-lethal chemical weapon designed to make enemy soldiers attracted to each other, was considered by the U.S. Air Force. This hypothetical weapon, mentioned in a 1994 Department of Defense document, aimed to disperse sexual pheromones among enemy forces to generate mutual attraction, leading to mass confusion and panic. Along with the gay bomb, other ideas were discussed, such as remotely engineering body odors using compounds found in bad breath.
I've heard of the potential gay bomb before. They were really trying to come up with some pretty weird chemical weapons around that time.
And excessive sweating, with the goal of making the enemy so smelly that they could be easily detected by their opponents. However, there is no evidence that these weapons were used or that it's possible to create such a thing.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. When we say we're talking about conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, a lot of these things never existed and are not possible, right? They don't make any sense. What's true about them is that the government legitimately had these ideas, wrote them down, and tried to investigate them, right? There were a lot of really insane ideas that the CIA has tried to pursue. A lot of weird chemical weapons, a lot of weird use of drugs, especially. You know, a lot of these make no sense, are impossible, right? There's no logic to them, but they tried them, right? They wanted to investigate them. That's the sort of true part of this.
If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join my Discord. Link in the description.
All right. That is the end of this video. That was definitely sort of an amusing one. We had some more and less serious conspiracy theories. I believe every single one of these was U.S. related, I think. Oh, no, there's the Canadian gaydar. There you go. So all U.S. and Canada related. There are definitely some conspiracy theories outside of North America, but definitely a lot of the most famous conspiracy theories are associated with the U.S. government in some way, the CIA in particular, because they're getting up to some weird stuff. You know what I mean? And so, you know, it makes sense that you'd have a lot of conspiracy theories about them, some of them which aren't true, but can be relatively believable when you see what else the CIA was and is still getting up to. Like I said, you know, events happen, people immediately point to the CIA. If you've got no evidence of that, then, you know, you shouldn't really do that. However, there is definitely stuff the CIA is getting up to that we won't know until years later, until some of those documents are declassified, and even then, there may be some stuff that we'll never find out about. You know, there's some events that we just don't have all of the evidence for, and so you can either, I tend to refrain, say I don't know, or you can speculate to your heart's desire, whatever you want. There's just some things we don't know. But, as we saw here, there are some conspiracy theories that, you know, there turns out to be some truth behind them. So this was definitely an interesting video from the Paint Explainer. First video of his I've seen. I definitely enjoyed it. Maybe I'll check out more of his videos. Feel free to recommend any down below. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down in the description. So with that, thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.